The contending parties are each seeking to get control of the state. The truth is, the bourgeois likes the state interference, so long as it helps him make a private gain and profit. He dislikes that interference when it tends to favor public as distinct from the private advantage. The government of the day sided with the capitalists and gave them the use of the police, ostensibly to keep the ring clear, but in reality to try and crush unionism. The squatter was at first called upon to pay for any police sent to his station, but if any disturbance took place, the cost was then thrown upon the country. It was not too difficult to have a disturbance, especially as the press was strongly anti-labour. The fight was a costly and unsatisfactory one to the pastoralists. Pastoral employees had made no new or unreasonable demands. The squatters had cut wages, and this was bad enough. But when they were going to fill white men's places with Chinese and further insisted on freedom of contract, shearers and shed hands had no alternative but to go on strike. Every effort at conciliation was made by the workers, and without avail. It had become clear that since the ruling authorities had never intended to give fair play, they laid their plans to crush the men, and it stands to the credit of the workers that in spite of all of the powers of the state, of suffering and of imprisonment, they stood true to the cause they fought for, and they proved themselves worthy sons of the great white race. The fight was bitter. It could not be otherwise. The marvel was that it did not result in civil war. The efforts of the leaders to try and effect settlement on reasonable lines, and the fixed idea of the men that they were engaged in an industrial strike, alone saved the country from civil war. At one time it was feared that it would come to that, and to prepare for such a contingency, one of the leaders of the ALF and myself held a private conference at 3 o'clock in the morning whilst travelling on the Adelaide Express to Melbourne, and came to an understanding as to certain action to be taken by myself in the southern colonies. The men were becoming very exasperated at the time, and they had gone to extremes. They would have taken possession of the country. The military was sent out west and had to drag Nordenfeldts, Gatling guns, and a 9-pounder about over the back country. Colonial Secretary Tozer issued a manual of instructions, and under the heading, Firing to be Effective, they were told to pick out the leaders, and not to fire over their heads, but to shoot straight. Major Ricardo, when addressing them before they started, said, "Go forward, gentlemen, and defend your hearths and homes." In what way were they in danger, he did not say, and probably had not the remotest idea. The officers were all made. The soldiers were a huge joke to the bushmen. They played tricks on them, but the officers seemed to take the business with immense seriousness. They kept up sentry duty and turned out on the slightest alarm. Everything the employers did was right. Everything that the unionists did was wrong. Any interference was called hindering, riot, and unlawful assembly. Those were the real dragnets. Any shearer's camp could be called an unlawful assembly, and for those alleged offences, 32 members of the Australian Workers' Union were sentenced in 1894. State intervention during the shearers' strike is the principal example of financial interests married to entrenched political elites. The police and military were used to break unions. Unions who were endeavouring to maintain Australian standards of employment and repel their ethnic cleansing by the use of scab Chinese labour. 13 leaders of the strike were charged with sedition and conspiracy. The capitalists with an interest in cheap slave labour utilised all legal and armed avenues to crush the union. These 13 men, amongst many, many others, of shearing union men who were put behind bars for standing true to principle and good practice.